The next speaker is Jerome Nikolai Warren, and please, you have the floor. Thank you for speaking.
So I'm talking about cooperative economics and management, which is kind of an emerging, I guess, field we're developing, a group of which I'm part, and basically focusing on the overlaps with relational economics and distinctions as well. So I'm working for the Académie Belgique, it's a postdoc, and this is part of the work I'm doing there as well. And so just to recap, and we've had these ideas discussed, and I don't need to maybe go into them in such detail, but we have relational economics, critical management, critical accounting, and other domains that have recently emerged that one could call a kind of a revolution. And I misquote Nietzsche here on purpose. Of course, Nietzsche said God is dead and we have killed him. But I'm saying here the firm is dead. The firm as we have known it is dead and we have killed it. And so, of course, as has been said, we have lots of issues like communication, for instance. The name Luhmann has been discussed here, that have been introduced or injected into political economy, into economics, and management as well, and into accounting. And it seems to me that there are still some gaps, especially in terms of the curriculum. People who are studying management, people who are studying economics today are still largely learning the standard model. There are slow changes happening. And just as an example, we had Oliver Williamson mentioned in the last talk by Jakob Rintoff, and his interpretation of opportunism. So this is from a chapter of Greg Dow's 2018 book, The Labor Managed Firm, where he says that basically he's discussing Williamson's notion of opportunism that Williamson sees as coming from workers who are shirking their labor. So you have supervision in a firm, you have a manager, you have workers, and the manager is tasked with supervising the workers who, of course, are all lazy and they don't work, so that's why they need to be supervised. But Dow says the deeper problem is that authority, in fact, establishes the structural preconditions under which employer opportunism can flourish. Small numbers, impacted information, and a tool, decision by fiat, tailor-made for the unilateral pursuit of self-interest. So opportunism, different than what Williamson implies, can actually come from both sides. It can come from the employer or the manager as well. So basically, in the whole discussion that has happened today, I haven't heard the mention of cooperatives. I walked by a co-op store from the train station towards here. And in fact, if you open up an economics textbook, you don't actually see really any mention of cooperatives. And if they are mentioned, they are a niche phenomenon. They're considered temporary. Sometimes it's considered something that is a result of a market failure or a state failure that then disappears over time. And at the same time, we do have over 1 billion members of cooperatives worldwide. That's an eighth of the population. You have actually interest in cooperatives by multilateral organizations like the UN. The EU has taken a much greater interest in cooperatives in recent years. There's even a social economy plan, social economy action plan, and other policies that we could even discuss. And of course, interorganizational cooperation as well, which is closer, I would say, to the relational economics field itself. Even the UN declared the decade that just ended 2 years ago as the decade of cooperatives, especially because of the role of cooperatives in stabilizing the global economy after the financial crisis. So a lot of financial cooperatives ended up much more stable during and after the crisis than their commercial bank counterparts. This got the attention of the UN at least. Of course, also in 2012, the cooperative principles, which I'll return to in detail, were declared UNESCO World Cultural Heritage. This was actually on the part of the German Cooperative Federation, which I think is very interesting. So the International Labour Organization, of course, has Recommendation 193, which, depending on how you interpret international law, is it just something that we consider a convention, or is it really law? Advises or requires states to actually introduce education that promotes cooperatives in their national education policies. In fact, so that's from, I think, the year 2002. And however, there doesn't seem to be any definitive summary of the state of the art of cooperatives or cooperation in either economics or management at the moment, and therefore a gap appears to exist. So before I define what is cooperative economics and management, I can say what it is not. And it is not the tradition that largely is related to, I mentioned Yugoslavia earlier today in a question, or in a comment rather. There's Ward, Vanek, and Domar, who were studying differentially the Yugoslav model and basically just applying neoclassical economics to the labor-managed firms that existed in Yugoslavia. That was not so effective, and people don't really talk about the so-called Illyrian firm nowadays. David Ellerman has called this a dead horse, and I'm not going to get into it in more detail, but of course it's also not just superimposing new institutional economics of the type of Will Williamson or Henry Hansman on top of cooperatives. It's not just applying neoclassical economics to cooperation, it's not applying cooperation to neoclassical economics, as Wieland says about business ethics. It's not just pasting together business and ethics, something new is emerging. It's also not economic history or economic archaeology, to paraphrase Henry Hansman, who is a lawyer who has very much dedicated his life and his career to re-establishing cooperative law as an independent discipline. And I heard a speech by Hagen, sorry, two first names, last year in Athens, where he basically was told that what he was doing as he was starting his career is legal archaeology. You're researching a dead field. And of course, history has proven quite differently. So, and as I see it, it's economics and management is reimagined from the logic of cooperation, and especially with an emphasis on firms that are managed by laborers, which is not something that one has to see necessarily as radical or socialist. In fact, John Stuart Mill, who is not a socialist, wrote in his Theory for Political Economy that if the economy develops as it is developing, at some point we will have laborers that are managing their firm. Of course, that didn't happen as Mill imagined. And in fact, Greg Dow has established 3 principles why that may not be the case. And those are imperfection, asymmetry, and replication. And in fact, of course, the first one is just that markets are not perfect, as neoclassical economists suggest. The fact that capital is not equivalent to labor. In fact, capital can be sliced and diced, and you can sell it in the market, in the secondary market, and it's very liquid. Traditionally, it's parcelable, whereas labor is inalienable. And of course, you see in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal and endowed by certain inalienable rights. They are not atoms, they are, so to speak, atomistic rights. They are indivisible. These are the fundamental rights. So labor is something that you do. You cannot get rid of it. You can't put it in a box and sell it somewhere else. And at the same time, what Dow calls the replication principle. So in fact, you can't attribute traits to a cooperative unfairly. So many people say, well, the reason there are so few cooperatives is, they're hippies. A bicycle repair shop, it might work there, but not in a large multinational enterprise. As enterprises like Mondragon, which is, I think, the 7th largest firm in Spain, billions in revenues and in profits every year, they have managers. So it's not just hippies, working in a bike repair shop. So now that we know what it is not, what is cooperative economics and management? So Ludwig Fleck, Polish virologist and epistemologist, talked about so-called exoteric thought collectives. So the thought collective is the idea behind Thomas Kuhn's paradigm, and Kuhn actually mentions Fleck is the first citation that Kuhn has in his Theory of Scientific Revolutions. So in this book published in 1934, he talks about exoteric and esoteric. So of course an exoteric thought collective brings together different groups who are working on different topics even. And I would say that those communities who are most central are those in management and economics working on these topics, but also anthropology, ecology, finance, and psychology. And in as far as these folks are working on specifically democratic principles, such as abolitionism, which of course is a tradition, and I created this kind of map here. So you have relational economics, you have the shared field of critical management and accounting. And again, what I would say distinguishes cooperative economics and cooperative management is this focus on the insider-outsider relationship and the principle, I would say, of abolitionism, which of course is the aim to end slavery and unfreedom, as William Lloyd Garrison would say. So David Ellerman, in his book Neo-Abolitionism, which was just released 2 years ago, makes this case. So of course it's not just restricted to cooperatives, but of course they form a bedrock as a historical phenomenon. We have people like David Sloan Wilson, an evolutionary biologist who talks about multi-level selection, and seeing this even as a means to make groups, to render groups more cooperative. So groups, firms, inter-firm networks, nations, wherever. So, and again, very much shared in this sense with relational economics and the work that has been discussed here today. And again, this importance of inclusive stakeholder dialogue, I don't need to repeat the last speech. And again, this notion of critical management and critical accounting, and the importance of informality, including the blurred division of labor. This is a picture of one of the first formal modern cooperatives. This is the Toad Lane store in Roskilde in Manchester in the UK, founded in 1844. And basically the members, it was a consumer cooperative, but where members actually worked. So again, it's a blurred division of labor. You don't have the manager, you don't have the necessarily doing one thing every day at the same time. There are other cooperatives that practice these. Of course, differences in the application there. Also, this notion of polycontextuality, I would say, is very much present in the cooperative movement because there are principles. There are 7 principles, and I will get to those, but they're not a recipe, and how they are applied in practice varies over time and place. I would define it as what Karl Popper calls a propensity, which is a real force that perhaps isn't perceivable, like gravity in a sense. So we can talk about complex causality as well, like Myrdal in this sense, but okay, that's getting more into philosophy. So how is it different? I would say again, there are specific principles according to which most cooperatives or every cooperative in the world is aligned. And of course these began in 1895 as the International Cooperative Alliance was founded. Actually at the first session in the UK, I think it was in London. And again, this focus on membership. So it's not only stakeholders, but members. And there's this great article by Silvia Sacchetti and Carlo Bozaga, where they really get into Henry Huntsman's theory of the ownership of enterprise and suggest it's not ownership that's so important necessarily, it's membership. Who is a member? And that is sometimes analogous, but not the same as ownership. And again, I've mentioned this tradition of abolitionism, which problematizes the insider-outsider dichotomy. And there's a long tradition, of course, in very early stages, and even in the Roman Empire, there were slave rebellions. Spartacus, of course, you've probably seen the film with Kirk Douglas. Jesus, you might have heard of him. People like Augustine of Hippo, Toussaint Louverture, leader of the Haitian Revolution, Josiah Warren, an American anarchist and inventor who developed a store where products were priced very fairly, and actually everybody could look into the books and how did the prices emerge. So you have William Lloyd Garrison, I mentioned the famous abolitionist, Pierre Proudhon, French anarchist who talked about property. Karl Marx, you might have heard of him as well, Leo Tolstoy, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. These are all people who I guess Cornelius Castoriadis would suggest display what could be called civic imaginary, or that John Dewey would say, we're looking for the great community, which is an evolutionary, it's a process, I guess you would say. And I would say another distinction is that cooperatives are not necessarily creating shared value. Many of them are, and it's a very closely related concept, but there's rather, I would say, a panorama of purposes. So you have things like maintaining certain resources. The Roman Colosseum, in fact, is managed by a cooperative. They manage the ticketing and maintenance and so on, so there are archaeologists working with them as well. So are they creating value? It's questionable. That was too some of it too, by the way, on a book cover with from Susan Buck-Morris. Anyway, don't want to get into too many of the details. So, cooperatives are not garbage pickers, as a study by Raphael Ziegler and co-authors suggests. So they do different things at different times. So again, the idea of meeting community members' needs is very much at the center. Marvin Brown, a philosopher, talks about moving from an economy of property to one of provision. And these are exactly the types of thoughts that Vanek and Doma, these Yugoslavian economists, did not get. So the idea was for them that cooperatives are maximizing the profit of their members, of the workers, for instance. But this isn't necessarily the case. There are other purposes as well. So also looking at ownership as stewardship, and looking at notions like mutualism that are of an ecological nature. So I might get into that if I have time, and as well as regeneration. So there is an emerging literature. Most of these books are quite new. The Oxford Handbook of Mutual, Cooperative and Co-Businesses is a little bit older. I think it's 2007. But the other two books actually came out this year. The middle book is by two agricultural economists, and the one on the right is coming from the St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada. So looking at humanistic governance in democratic organizations. So that's a fascinating book that actually just came out. And this is a book that is not out yet. This is a mock-up. This is not the final cover, but I'm working on together with Lucio Pigiero, Jamin Hübner, Kemi Ogunyemi, and Saba Vikari, the Routledge Handbook of Cooperative Economics and Management. So all the citations you see from 2024 will be from this book. So they are, so to speak, future citations. So what do these firms and enterprises do? They create social innovations, partly out of necessity. And I would say that these are the types of innovations that are very similar to what Josefina has called a relational rent. So these are people coming together through the act of cooperation, producing something that was not there before. And secondly, as Carmen Guzman and her co-authors say, and there's a very fascinating chapter, these social innovations can go beyond to become quite transformative. This is actually a picture on the right here from an article by Kyriasis and Metaxas, looking actually from about social evolution. So you have two people maybe who start recycling, and they convince another person and another person. In the end, the idea of recycling becomes quite self-evident. So it's a transformative innovation in this sense. So this is just an example of the second type of innovation. So the first type, of course, you have the early cooperatives like the store in Toad Lane, basically resulting from people being dissatisfied with the quality of products. There was a lot of denaturing. You didn't have any quality standards at this time, the early stages of capitalism. So you couldn't trust, some kind of a seal of approval. So people got together and purchased products in bulk to ensure that the prices and the quality, were adequate, were suitable. And of course, there were things like exploitation. Still are. There's a poster right there. Can employees lead themselves? I think these are still questions for this year. So things like the governance, these can also be seen as innovations. We will have a chapter by Simon Peck, who's been working on this issue of sortition or lotteries, which go back to the Greek, form of democracy, looking at rotation. How does one increase the chances and opportunities for leadership development in organizations, perhaps using methods like rotation or sortition, random selection, or even sociocracy, which was developed by Auguste Comte in the 19th century, but which John McNamara and his co-authors are re-enlivening and attempting to reintroduce into cooperatives. There's a chapter by Francesca Martinelli, who is critiquing the unicorn model of startups that you have seen popularized in Silicon Valley with firms like Uber, and is looking at the so-called Pegasus company, Pegasus relating to the constellation, because it's not the single company, but it is the ecosystem, as it's sometimes called, or the relationships between the different companies that is really producing an innovation. Also distributed leadership in managing technological change with things like AI. You do have Sabine Riesmüller, who was a doctoral candidate of Joseph Wieland, who's talking about the relational management of AI. We also have a chapter by Louis Cousin and co-authors about creating decentralized structures for managing technology. I mean, there's lots of empirical research on this as well. So, for instance, Belloc and co-authors found that cooperatives were actually more likely to invest in robots than capitalist firms, perhaps because the workers are less afraid about being replaced by automation. It could be an argument. There's also the recent research by Jan Hyman and Natalie Main and Joseph Blasi about IT firms. They found a significant increase in the value of the company based on increasing democracy or actually being a cooperative. So they suggest perhaps it's because of the identification that workers have with the firm. So we have even things like community regeneration. I won't get into this. This is there's a chapter I'm writing together with Abolitionism. So actually this picture is quite interesting. It talks about viability. So the neoclassical economists focus on efficiency, as is shown here, is quite damaging because ecosystems that you find in nature, or even traffic patterns or water distribution or electricity networks that are too efficient or quite brittle, when circumstances change, they collapse. So there is a certain balance that's needed between efficiency and, so to speak, redundant connections. So you need both, and if you don't have them, the system can be at risk of collapsing. So Bob Ulanovitz is a co-author of mine, has talked about the so-called window of viability. So we don't need firms that are efficient, and we don't need, of course, firms on the other hand that are just sort of a mess. You need to be somewhere in the middle. I won't actually about that's too much. So in the end, what it seems to me to be the case before I get into the principles is that you have in German it's the word Streitkultur, a culture of arguments basically. And as I say at the bottom here, there is no cooperative Catholicism, although there is a Catholic cooperativism. I don't mean to say that doesn't exist. But they have been subject to debate over the centuries as long as they've existed. I list as an example, and debate, discussion, in the Habermasian sense, discourse. Ian McPherson, the late Ian McPherson, who was the head of the International Cooperative Alliance, has done so much for the cooperative movement over I almost said centuries, the decades he was a part of it, actually struggled quite fervently at the last ICA meeting, 1995, the centennial meeting, where the cooperative values were redefined, to include a value for concern for community, which he was successful in. So in fact, as you see, different cooperative federations worldwide have different cultures, different values. I just listed as an example here the German Federation, which is very much, one might say, conservative. It's very much concerned with self-reliance, self-help, and on mutual economic benefit. That's why the strongest German cooperatives are the banks, the Volksbank, for instance, is very strong. Raiffeisen, Volksbank, exactly. Urban and rural. Oh, that's not a cooperative. Not a cooperative. The Spanish and Latin American federations are very much more focused on solidarity. They even have this from the social solidarity economy. So different culture. Even Italy, as I mentioned, has even differences within the country. It's the strongest cooperative movement in the world, Italy, in fact. And they have the socialist communists, they have the Catholic, and they have sort of liberal democratic versions of it. So just very quickly, because I don't have much time, to review the 7 principles, and I don't have time to review all of them in detail. I will do 3, actually, if I have time, 3 of them a little bit more in detail. There's the voluntary local membership, so non-discrimination, democratic member control, which usually is, well, I'll get into. There's member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives or intercooperation, and then concern for community. So democratic member control is very important because obviously hierarchy is something that cooperatives do have as opposed to what is sometimes said. So they do deal with this insider-outsider dichotomy in terms of membership. That means they have a dual nature. There's a commercial identity, they are businesses, they do make profits. But at the same time, they are a community. So this is part of what being a member of a cooperative means. So you have the benefit, of course, as well of that cultural identity, as Anna Pusa is arguing in one of her chapters for the the upcoming handbook. She's actually writing 2 chapters. So as an example of that, the Basque region in Spain has not 2 but 3 different types of employment. So typically you are either an employee or you're self-employed, but in the Basque region there's a 3rd type, which is cooperative employment, which means I'm an owner and an employee. So because of the strong presence of cooperatives there. So most co-ops have the 1 member, 1 vote rule, which is different from the 1 share, 1 vote rule, of course, in a very humanistic sense. Of course, one can lead a critical discussion about this because voting can be employed strategically to keep certain people in power. I listed as an example here, you have this beautiful guy, you might remember him, Silvio Berlusconi, former Prime Minister of Italy, passed away. 1991, there was a political crisis in Italy that affected all the parties, including those associated with cooperatives, having a revolving door, corruption. Berlusconi, the media magnet, uses to catapult himself to power. So of course, just voting is not the solution, but again, these are discussions that are being led in the cooperative movement with people like Dow, Silvia Sacchetti, Posaga, I mentioned before, and Lucio Pinheiro, who was at this conference last year, who's talking about the multidimensionality of hierarchy. So to what extent do organizations serve their different members, stakeholders, whatever you want to call it, is not a simple linear question or a spectrum, but is in fact a multidimensional issue. In fact, again, this is a critical discussion. We even have people like Tegonza and David Ellerman who are basically saying every cooperative that isn't a worker cooperative is not a real cooperative. But again, these are discussions that are being had. So the 3rd principle, the second one I'm introducing of 3, is member economic participation, which can mean a number of things. It can mean, again, this fuzzy division of labor. Here's the Park Slope Cooperative in New York City, in Brooklyn, 15,000 members. It's a consumer cooperative where members are required to work as part of their membership. So stocking shelves, working at the cash register. Here's a member that's working, another one's buying things. It can mean, again, investing in the company. This is Les Ailes, a company in the Lorraine region in, what is today, France? Was once Germany, but no, let's not have that discussion. Where 40% of the company is owned. It's a windows and door production company. They produce tens of thousands of windows every year indoors. And 40% of the company is owned by the holding company that's owned by the workers. And it can mean, again, something like Co-op Fund, which is the largest cooperative development fund in the world in Italy, $500 million that has been utilized to strengthen the cooperative sector there. So patronage is a very interesting phenomenon, relational transaction, you could say. So the way that cooperatives deal with the transactions with their members is different than how they deal with the transactions with others. So again, if you work or shop at a cooperative, you take part in the profits because, again, you are a member, so you actually are, in part, reinvesting the profits, and members do receive part of their the profits as a dividend, as a patronage dividend, as a thank you, so to speak, for the continuing and ongoing cooperation. Skip that. So we have things like indivisible reserves as well. So cooperatives have traditionally been kept out of getting equity or loans, so they have developed their own, so to speak, equity by retaining profits. And many cooperatives retain up to 90 or more % of their profits, even today. So it's a culture. And they have been shown to have actually a counter-cyclical effect. There's research by Piero Ammirati that has shown this. I didn't list it here. So, and this is the last one I introduced, which is intercooperation. And I think Mondragon, which is one of the most popular cooperative federations in the world, is a great example. This is Arasate Mondragon in Spanish, Arasate in Basque. It's, again, I think the 7th largest company in Spain, billions in revenues. There are 80,000, I think, workers there in hundreds of different cooperatives. And what you saw, one very interesting example, is the largest and oldest cooperative of Mondragon, which is Fagor, started in 1956. Great story, went bankrupt as a result of the property collapse in Spain and the financial crisis, so they produced electric equipment, kitchen appliances and so on. So in fact, the Federation decided that dissolving the company would be more beneficial than injecting more liquidity and so on. But they didn't just fire everyone. They found a way such that actually, after 3 years, I think it was, 92% of the members were either located in another cooperative in the Federation or found some kind of a retirement scheme. So again, this is a way that even companies final will and testament can be resolved through, again, the process of cooperation. So you have things like the conversion of companies to cooperatives that can be seen as a matter of ecological or social sustainability, rather. So I need to wrap up. There's a great essay, actually, in the Harvard Business Review 1990 that democracy is inevitable, that as societies become more complex, as you were saying, the challenges that they face, they need a more inclusive management of their members, of stakeholders. And so one can actually see a realization of 4 of the SDGs by, again, converting companies into, employee-owned, for instance, firms. In the UK, you have almost 1,500 firms that are employee-owned. Half of these have been created in the last 2 years. It's through legislation that has been created giving tax benefit to those who convert their firms to employee ownership, in fact, that keep jobs local and keep the knowledge local and the decision making. So I don't really have time to get into all the rest of this. So my conclusion here, I think that relational economics and cooperative management economics are 2 siblings. They're very similar. They're seeing management as stewardship or management as a relation of relations is a very similar concept. And to cite this essay by Matt Hancock, current members of a cooperative have a legacy of responsibility to ensure that the cooperative survives as a strong and vibrant business enterprise for the benefit of future generations of members and a wider community of cooperatives it serves. Very similar to this graphic that we just saw. I don't have time to get into this graphic, which is very interesting in itself. I'll be back for questions. So just the conclusion, it's an emerging paradigm combining economics and management that focuses on cooperation, in fact, focusing on certain principles, on the notion of abolition, freeing people to enjoy life, as Aristotle said, moving from necessity to freedom, and again, this insider-outsider dichotomy. And it has distinctions with and overlaps with relational economics, and I mentioned Lisel, which is both a B corporation, so it has principles, but it also has employee ownership. So they seem to be 2 related phenomena. And that's it. So, tusen Dank.
Thank you very much.
It's always
Thank you for a very
last
good.
speaker because the audience is so tired. Everyone is a captive audience. You don't have the energy to leave the room.
Oh yeah, that's already a question. Yes, please.
Many thanks for the promotion of the program.